In today's session, we're going to be talking about trends. A lot of people would like to make a huge issue of trends, but I'd like to encourage us not to make a huge issue of them, but to understand that it's okay to explore and discuss and dialogue even what our personal preferences are. Since World War II, the Western world has actually gone through a huge change in the musical landscape. There was old-time worship or music happening sort of previously to World War II, but then once we jump into the 1960s and 70s, as we referenced in the musical history lessons, that we see the rise of the rock band and folk music coming into play and how that actually expressed itself in some of the denominations at that time. So we see the rise of contemporary worship. At the same time, we've got traditional worship. And even though both of these trends sound quite different from one another, it's important for us to know that the vehicle of contemporary or traditional worship is still just a method to accomplish the same purpose, which is to glorify God through worship. The definition of the word trend are these two sentences. A trend is the general course of a prevailing tendency, and to go in a particular direction, and to follow a custom or to show a tendency. And there's three main points that I'd like to bring to our attention today concerning trends. The first one is trends are temporary. Trends are not something that are long-lasting and a core value that is unchanging, but trends are temporary. So as we're looking through how we're shaping a worship ministry and how trends impact that, I think it is important for us to remember these trends are temporary and it will look different 10 years from now, 20 years from now, just as trends looked differently in lots of areas of society, from fashion or musical styles and preferences even 20, 40, 100 years ago. They're just temporary. The second point I'd like to make is that trends are not principles. Trends are not principles. They're not the things that are long-lasting, foundational, the things that are unchanging. They're not principles. And the third point is that trends do come from man. These are based on our stylistic preferences, and that's okay, but trends are part of the humanity coming through the worship expression. You'll find that in the Bible there's lots of different trends even expressed from the Old Testament through the New Testament. If you want to look at the different styles of instruments that were used or the styles of vocalists, you might hear things like call and response from male and female, and choirs and horns and strings, or on the cymbals, right? So we can see trends, but this is the part that comes from man that can be changing. They're not principles, they are temporary, and they do come from man. They're not necessarily God-given. So as we're talking about how to navigate through changing styles and trends, here are some points that can help you stay grounded through the midst of it all. The first one is talking about the content of worship. The second one is talking about the structure of worship. And the last one is talking about the style of worship. Okay, so when we're talking about the content of worship, we're saying that the content of worship is non-negotiable, that it needs to be Bible-based, and that the art of worship is actually the telling of God's story. So making sure that in the midst of all the changing trends and styles, that the content of the worship is staying biblically focused. There's a word called anthropocentric, which is actually talking about the style in which we write the song lyrics. It's talking about being man-centered, anthropology, the study of humanity. So when you're looking at the song selection, what is the content of your songs actually saying, as opposed to maybe something that's God-centered? Staying in the vein of having God-centered lyrics in our songs is a really good example of how to keep the content of your worship non-negotiable and biblically based. The other one is the structure of worship being grounded in the principles of God's desire to commune with His people, and that response to Him and to each other. So my example of this is the structure of worship. We can be like David out in the field and singing to the Lord, having private worship, but there's a lot in the Bible that talks about the gathering of the saints and actually not forsaking that and coming together and expressing the congregational expression of worship. So the structure of worship in the midst of all the trends, making sure that there's the element of gathering together so that we can edify, encourage, and build one another up. The last point is actually the style of worship, being totally dependent on the cultural heritage or the preference of the worshiping community. So when you're looking at the content of worship, we're saying that's non-negotiable, and we're looking at the structure of worship and saying there's some pretty good biblical framework here for what the structure of worship should look like. But over here, stylistically, you actually are having more liberties to actually express how that worship is coming across. So whether it leans more into the contemporary style of worship or the traditional style of worship. And even as we've referenced in the foundations of the worship department, having individualized worship expression, taking into consideration the people and the demographic and all of those different factors within a church, that is where you can take liberties and not feel like you're actually building something that's outside of how God intended worship to be, but you can be expressive within that lane of style. So to continue safely navigating the waters of change when it comes to trends and styles, I just want to encourage you to maintain your core pillars and principles, keep those in place. And just know that the balancing act will be staying current, which is important, without jolting your congregation around with drastic changes, and to encourage you to keep discussing and talking about the current trends and styles and changes with your leadership team and your senior pastor.